Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark Magnacca. My co-host Rob Brant and I are back with Anne-Raphaëlle Audouin, CEO of Nukik Corporation, the 100% Inuit-owned developer behind the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Link. In part one, we heard how Nunavut came to be one of the most isolated jurisdictions in the developing world, why 138 million liters of foreign diesel flow into the territory every year, and how Nukik became the first Arctic electricity developer in North America to be certified by the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO. In this second part, we get into the project itself. Anne-Raphaëlle walks us through the full route, 1,200 kilometers of dual-use transmission and fiber optic, running north from Churchill, Manitoba to connect 5 of the Kivalliq's 7 communities to the Continental grid for the first time. She explains what changed in April 2025. Manitoba elected the first Indigenous premier across the country, and subsequently Manitoba and Nunavut signed a historic joint declaration, and 50 megawatts of hydropower were committed specifically to this project. That moment turned a concept into commercially viable undertaking. We then move into the financing architecture that hopefully will provide the foundation for the business. The role of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, the role of Agnico Eagle Mines as the anchor customers whose energy contracts can provide the bankable revenue base, and why federal commitment remains the one piece necessary to unlock the entire capital stack. We also discussed the hydropower and wind generation potential that transmission infrastructure would unlock, and also speak about Anne-Raphaëlle's role on the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, a trilateral body spanning Canada, the United States, and Mexico. If you haven't listened to part one yet, we encourage you to start there. But if you're coming straight to the project numbers, this is where it's all at.
Anne-Raphaëlle, talk then about the status of the project. And first of all, we're talking about the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Corridor project, and where exactly, from where to where, what points are we talking about, and what's the status of the project today?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Link is a 1,200 kilometer dual-use multi-purpose transmission asset that would be paired with fiber optic. It would connect near Churchill in northern Manitoba, cross the Nunavut-Manitoba border, essentially as a straight shooting arrow pointing north, and then serve almost the entirety of the Kivalliq region, with 5 out of 7 hamlets being connected to the Continental grid, and the Ranking Inlet Meliadine mine, which is owned by Agnico Eagle Mines, which is the largest Canadian gold miner at this time, and I think the second largest gold miner in the world. And serve those loads, residential, government, businesses, and industrial loads, and obviously bring fiber optic into those regions. Right now, as I said, but I'll repeat it, everything functions on diesel. It's not like you have diesel and some wind, or diesel and some geothermal, or diesel and some natural gas. Everything is 100% on diesel. There's no other base load, which is the stable, best type of electricity you need to keep your system stable, which is a good thing to have in a region as cold as the Arctic. There's no optionality. So it would be life-changing for a multitude of reasons.
What's Manitoba's position? Have they got excess power that they're looking to sell?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'll go a few years back. When I started on the project in 2022, it was very hard to engage with the province of Manitoba. And that was one of the key reasons at the time why the federal government was not fully at the table on the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Link. And then last year, in April 2025, something historic happened because Premier Canoe, the Premier of Manitoba, and the former Premier of Nunavut, Premier PJ Akyagak, got together and signed a joint declaration to create a strategic energy and economic corridor between Manitoba and Nunavut. And by doing so, Premier Canoe repatriated expiring hydro export contracts to the US and carved out 50 megawatts of that repatriation and dedicated it towards the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Link, not just to Nunavut, but very specifically to the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Link. That completely changed the law and order for the project, because up until then, we were trying to get the parties at the table. But since April 2025, and that's the reason we are almost done the development phase and getting into engineering and procurement. That's the reason why we got certified by MISO. We were able to file our transmission service request with Manitoba Hydro, have commercial agreements in place with Kivalliq Corporation, which is the territorial utility. That's the reason why all of those commercial milestones and technical milestones were completed, was because Manitoba committed the power to the project. Up until then, we had a concept, we had an idea, but we didn't have a product that would flow through the transmission line. That was a complete shift in the paradigm of developing the project, whereby now we have partners and we're just trying to crack the code on how we're going to make it happen, with all the caveats that I mentioned earlier with the federal government and trying to find the winning recipe. So Manitoba Hydro does not have surplus electricity at this time. However, we are planning to put shovel in the ground in 2028 and commission by 2032. That is a bit of an alignment of the stars, because Manitoba Hydro is putting out call for proposals as we speak, and some of them have been awarded already, to build new wind and also to build new peak natural gas. And so that is what they're taking all the right steps to reinforce their system, which is already more than 80% hydropower, so 80% renewable, and continue to be a major player in the heart of the prairies, serving potentially Nunavut, hopefully soon, and then being interconnected to all those states just south of Manitoba. So not worried about supplying power. The grid is built and generation is built over long periods of time. What we need to do is have the integrated resource planning mindset that actually unlocks that foresight and allows you to be good planners of your own resources.
Wow, what a story. And, Indigenous leadership, when we talk about the Premier of Manitoba, right away gets it, right? There's still a lot to be done, but what a game changer.
Yes.
In terms of attitudes, and, it just shows it's not enough for people to think, oh, I'm going to do something good and help out, right? It's how do you provide that empowerment to the Indigenous peoples across the country to get things done? And that's, who you represent and is driving this forward in terms of the Inuit and Nunavut. This whole thing starts to build momentum, but I'm sure it is still frustrating. You mentioned earlier about, Agnico Eagle Mine. Can you talk about it a little bit, about their role and what they see and their contribution? Of course, you don't represent them, but from your perspective, what that brings to the table, having them so nearby.
Yeah. So Agnico Eagle Mines, they've been in the region, so in the Kivalliq region of Nunavut, for close to 20 years. They have two operating mines in the region: Meadowbank, that's close to Baker Lake, so it's inland, and then Meliadine, which is about 30 kilometers from Rankin Inlet, so on the west shore of the Hudson Bay. They know the Arctic quite well. They're also now active in other regions in Nunavut, obviously very active in Quebec and internationally. So they're very good neighbors to have, very experienced, and obviously have been doing very well lately with the price of gold and what's happening on the stock market. I think historically, it's important to reflect on the fact that mining, that story of opening a mine and then a town blooms, right, and stays forever afterwards, even after the mine goes. It is a well-known story around the world. And so we're seeing some of that happening in the Arctic, maybe not creating a town, but certainly creating the economic lightning in the bottle that you need to actually get people jobs, education, the capacity building. And so Agnico has been a force to reckon with in terms of what they've done for the territory. And mining overall for Nunavut, not just Agnico Eagle, but with other mines that are operating in the Baffin region, for example, mining activity represents 75% of the Nunavut GDP. Once you say that, you have to, as a decision maker, as a project proponent, as an actor in the Arctic, you really have to be responsible and think about what happens next. And my responsibility, the way I view it, and the guidance from my board is to say, we want mining to stay because it's a huge economic boost. And especially when you're lucky enough to work with companies like Agnico Eagle Mines, you keep them. You want to continue working with them because they are excellent corporate citizens. But you have to think about what happens next because those mines are going to close at some point, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 20 years, but they won't be there for, the next 3 generations. So the way we view a project like the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Link is a win-win-win, whereby you connect to a mine, you have this anchor customer that is actually very energy intensive, that can commit to buying a significant amount of power, and that becomes your bankable revenue, right? That you can take to market, that you can unlock investment, thanks to that track record of their activity in the region. And then you create more independent revenue pathways for the region by maybe one day being an exporter of power, because the transmission line we're building would be bidirectional. So who's to say that one day Nunavut won't be able to export excess, hydropower, if they develop hydropower, or if there's nuclear one day, they could export and put that power back onto the grid. You won't be able to access those independent revenue streams without infrastructure. And so Agnico gets it. They absolutely are committed to the idea of utilizing the role that they play right now under their core business of being miners, but to help that multi-generational aspirations for development that Inuit are calling for. But again, it's not just one party being able to unlock the whole puzzle. It's going to have to be tripartite, multiple parties at the table, but they are a critical piece of the undertaking, without which I really think we wouldn't have a project.
Yes. And what are some of those hydro opportunities in Nunavut for hydropower?
So hydropower has been documented for a few years in, I think, all 3 regions as medium to high potential. In the Baffin region, there is a hydro site that is currently under feasibility study. It's called the Kivalliq Hydro Project, which is a great project that would serve the Iqaluit, area. It's about, I think, 20 megawatts, so still on the smaller side of hydro developments, but it would be taking that community off of diesel, which would be quite exciting, as Iqaluit is the capital of Nunavut. In the Kivalliq region where I operate, we know that there are some world-class type hydropower resources, but that are very, very large. And so at some point you have to make some choices, right? If you're going to spend $3 billion on a transmission line connection, do you want to spend, another few billions on a hydropower site? I think it's all going to come down to the sequence of events, and whether you build that generation first or you build the transmission line first. I think Inuit are fully flexible, as long as people recognize that even if you have local hydro generation, to maximize the benefit of investing in a hydro site like that, you're still going to need to microgrid your territory. So a degree of transmission line is going to need to be built. And so this is why the KHFL, the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Link, was favored as an option early on. We're talking more than 10 years ago, because there's a recognition that we need that grid anyways, and that it's a key enabler for local generation down the road. And I would also mention that the west coast of the Hudson Bay has the best wind resources of the whole North American continent. It's very, very windy. And so onshore or offshore wind, as it's moving ahead with legislation in Canada, is of very high potential.
I'm sure most of our listeners weren't really aware of not only the opportunity specifically that you're responsible for, but also the other opportunities that are available once Canada gets things going and start to push these and raise these up the agenda. Can you also talk a little bit about the hydrofiber link, and maybe it's a bit about Nukik, but about the capital structure and how you're looking and some of the partners you have and those people who've expressed interest?
Yeah. Yeah, so we're going to have to de-risk the project with a degree of private capital investment, and it's becoming mainstream requirement from major bankers that work on the more concessional side of loans for major projects. But we have an ongoing partnership with the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and they are leading our financial work stream. We are doing market sounding as we speak to actually raise senior debt for the project. Then that allows us to do a bit of matching of the debt equity ratio to a CIB, a Canada Infrastructure Bank loan as well. And then the delta would need to be the federal backstop we talked about. And it's a moving target depending on the construct of your funding stack. There's a limit to how much private equity you can contemplate for a project of this nature, because the more you bring in, it reduces the amount of senior debt you can leverage, and also it makes the project more expensive just from a return of investment expectation perspective. So it's a fine line, but it's not something that can be done just with the federal government or just with the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and certainly not just with Inuit investment. So we're hoping that the different players that are going to need and want to be involved will solidify as we get closer to commercial close, which is hopefully going to happen sometime in 2026 or early 2027. And then our financial investment decision, FID, is something that would happen in 2028, so that we can, as I said, start construction by the end of 2028.
Okay, well, regulated infrastructure assets, many UK and continental investors, those are where they want to be. And the big pension funds.
Yes.
Those are the sort of streams that they like to tap into. So it sounds like so many of the critical components are in place, as long as there's that push to make it happen at all levels of government.
Yeah, I'll say to be real as well, right? Like, I think it's important for people to get an appreciation for how challenging some of those discussions can be. Nobody wants to take on the full risk, right? So everybody we're going to, and that's to be expected, and I think it's natural as well, is asking us to de-risk as much as possible. What this does is it creates a chicken and egg situation where people are saying, I'll be there if X is there. And then X says, I'll be there if Y is there. But, everybody's contingent on the next guy showing up. And so unless somebody blinks first and actually commits, and ideally, the largest player blinks first, then there's no real incentive for people to gather. It doesn't galvanize that momentum commercially that you're trying to build. And I think if I could just leave listeners on the financial question you asked with one comment is, at the end of the day, those major projects that are so defined by their public service nature need the federal government to blink first. And that has not happened. And I think that's the key source of frustration is Canada has not accepted yet the role that they ought to play in those projects. And so they are pushing it to the proponents, pushing it back onto the private sector without realizing that they are the critical factor that's going to enable those projects to move forward or not. And collectively, I think we probably have a responsibility to get the federal government to understand the role that they can play, and also maybe utilize and leverage international examples where it's been done that way. I'm looking at Greenland. Most of their infrastructure was built publicly, right? And they have one of the best redundant fiber optic coverage coming from Iceland, connecting to Canada. But those were understood to be very, very important investments to make for the country.
So interesting comparison with Greenland, because it has been top of mind right?
Yes.
They've both been, Canada and Greenland are both in the target of desirability for our southern neighbor, or some people down there. How does that infrastructure compare to what Greenland had versus what Nunavut has at the moment? Can you just give a top line overview? You've touched on it briefly, but just to explain a bit more, because that might help people benchmark in terms of the opportunity that's in front of Canada.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Mark, when we started the call, you used the word disgrace to describe some of what had not happened yet in Canada, and I would echo that, because when you go to Nuuk, or when you engage with Greenlandish representatives, and there are some recurring delegations of Canadian going to Greenland and also Iceland to another degree, you really realize that there's no engineering-based reason why the North could not be developed, to the degree where we're seeing across other Arctic nations, such as Greenland. So there's no embedded reasons why this is impossible or challenging or complex or unsurmountable. That's the number one observation that you make when you go there. Number two is that when you have reliable and clean infrastructure, such as, for them, it's a lot of hydropower. It's a critical enabler for things like housing, like education, like hospitals. And it's a key attraction factor to bring skilled labor as well. And Nunavut, I talk a lot about energy telecommunication. This is what I know, but I think the first thing that people would say when they go to Nunavut is that it feels like it's stuck 60 years behind in terms of the rest of Canada. And I'm being gentle. It is appalling, the living conditions that people are being asked to just put up with. Families of 8 or 10 living in a 2-bedroom apartment, gravel roads everywhere, airports with gravel runways, or runways that cannot accommodate large freight planes or cargo planes. So you have to just wait for the barge, and reducing your ability to have access to cargo year round. It's just the whole suite, the whole nexus, right, of what it means to have infrastructure. And that's what keeps me motivated to work on the project, is because I always say it's not an energy or telecommunication project. It's an infrastructure project in its very definition, where the day you build that asset, there's going to be a before very clearly and an after. And I do this for the economic development opportunities that I see, because once you are connected, you're in business and you are a master of your own destiny in terms of making those choices, because you have that backbone that can support those decisions. And so when you go to a place like Greenland, this is what you see. You see a nation that's, yes, Arctic, that has a very strong culture, but you don't see a 50 or 100-year divide in terms of the infrastructure you would see in Denmark versus what you see in Greenland. And that is drastically different from what you see between southern Canada and Nunavut, Canada.
Yes. I'm sure many of our listeners, Canada's perceived when outside, when somebody says Canada, there's all these positive values, progressive, ... And then you hear stories like this, and that does not fit with the story that Canada has told to the world and let told, right? It's not just Canada, it's people play it back and all that. And when you hear this, there's this huge opportunity, this huge gap, which is disgraceful. Greenland is a benchmark. I mean, Canada's a leader, and in terms of the G7, Canada has some of the most room of any G7 nations to invest in infrastructure and game-changing projects. And infrastructure is like that.
Yes.
You can't calculate it all,
yes.
right? It's like some of the projects here in the UK, just whether it's, HS1, the Elizabeth line, or different thing. Oh, look how expensive it is, et cetera. But it game changes, because once you connect things, all kinds of other things that you can't calculate up front happen. And it's about where do we want to go as a country and what needs to be done. And the world's changed. So if we don't look after all our regions, others are very interested in doing so for us.
Very much so. Yes.
Rob.
Yeah, and Raphael, I was going to ask about defense applications, because I'm sure, and you alluded to it, renewed interest in your project over the last 12 months. And can you imagine the Canadian government has made commitments in the billions of dollars to boost defense spending? Can you imagine fulfilling those requirements without sort of the spine corridor like the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Link?
Very good question. And it's an angle, it's interesting because when I started on the Kivalliq Hydro-Fibre Link, Arctic sovereignty and national security weren't very much talked about. And we were just talking 2022. The horizon and also the lay of the land has completely changed in just a handful of years. That's point number one. And I think it's accelerating now because we're realizing that we are completely unprepared, completely unprotected in the Arctic. And obviously the USA doesn't like that very much. But I think the Arctic sovereignty and the national defense angles are going to be critical pieces of putting this, the architecture of the deal together. If I were to just talk about the financing of the project, we have had many discussions with national defense over the years, as you can imagine, and the interest is there. I think it's, national defense over the years didn't used to have the deep pockets that it has now. So I think it's just within at least the bureaucracy of national defense. I think they're still trying, they have a bit of an identity crisis where they still see themselves as kind of small and, just having to kind of, call the USA really when we had an incident, and then the USA would take down whatever was happening in the Arctic, which is historically what we had to do. And now they're realizing that, oh my gosh, we actually have billions of dollars now in the coffers, but no one has used this kind of decision-making over this kind of pot of money maybe in our Canadian history. So I think this is, at my level at least, right, which there are other levels of interveners with national defense, but I think they're just trying to really understand their raison d'être now. Are we first of all, are we defending the Arctic against China, against Russia, or against the US? Are we administrators or are we procurement spenders? So they created this Arctic industrial strategy. We now have a defense procurement agency. Again, Canada tackles their response by creating more bureaucracy. So that's fine. Let's see what they do with it. But it's other countries would say, let's take actions first. And let's really go fast because we are trying to catch up a high-speed train here. Whereas Canada's response is to say, we're going to publish a strategy every year, and it's going to change every time there's a new government. And then we're going to create a bunch of crown corporations to manage this money. But we're not going to really spend it because we're just, we don't like spending that much money, especially in the Arctic. So I'm being a bit sarcastic here, but the defense angle is what is the most talked about item when it comes to those major projects, but it's the most nebulous item to navigate as a project proponent, because the criteria as to what's going to make the 2% or 5% NATO spending is not clear. The degree of partnership they're willing to contemplate with private project proponent is unclear, and I think their own relationship with the Crown is unclear.
Yes, interesting. And I don't think they're based in Iqaluit or Nunavut.
Not most of them, no.
Wow. Absolutely fascinating discussion. We've used up a lot of the time. We've gone over, but it's great conversation. I'd really like to ask you about being the Canadian representative on the Commission for Environmental Cooperation Joint Public Advisory Committee. It's one of the trilateral North American bodies spanning Canada, the US, and Mexico that are really important for all of us who live in North America. And they're not really appreciated and understood, but they work in the background and make things happen. Can you talk a little bit about what that's about and where it fits in to give our listeners some background? Because this is kind of the importance, like with the European Union has its structure, we have these trilateral commissions
Yeah.
and they're not so well known. If you wouldn't mind speaking on that for a little bit.
Yeah. So thank you for the opportunity to highlight the work of the North American Environmental Cooperation Commission, the CEC. So I was appointed by the Federal Minister of Climate Change at the time, Minister Catherine McKenna, in 2019. So I've been with them for a few years and reappointed over the years. I was the chair in 2025 for the organization, which was fantastic work. And the really, if I were to try and summarize, the work of the commission is to essentially implement what used to be known as NAFTA, right, and now is known as the USMCA. So those trade agreements for commercial ties between Mexico, Canada, and the USA, the understanding was we also have to look at the environment. We also have to look at our shared ecosystems, because sustainability, climate change, and all of those environmental matters don't have borders, and we are more connected than we're not as a continent. And so we really should look at those environmental priorities in lockstep as countries. As I'm sure you can appreciate, it's a different world. Some people refer to it as a different world order. We'll see where that takes us. But the USA has withdrawn from a number of those underpinning agreements, and the USMCA is on the hot seat, to say the least. So we'll see what happens next. I think the alignment on the administration side for all three countries is still very strong, and the programs that we are leading are still being, implemented, and we still have our public forums once a year. We have our, sessions with the parties every year as well, where we just look at the different priorities from the three countries and hear from the public on what is top of mind in those three jurisdictions. And it's the most interesting part, because you actually hear grassroots considerations. I remember, I'll just give you an example, but a few years ago, we were in Mérida in Mexico, and we heard a lot about two things. One was the train Maya that was being built, which was really at the intersection of environmental protection and economic development, right? So how was that tension going to be worked out? And obviously now the train, I think, is still under construction or fully built, and it is going to be a key economic lung for that region, touristically and otherwise, but it had to be done under certain conditions. And the other things that were brought up was agriculture, intensive agriculture, and the use of pesticides, and also the fact that China was buying a lot of land in Mexico to have very, very large pork raising facilities, like cattle facilities, which as a Canadian, I had no idea. So I think it's just to highlight the fact that those organizations have a critical role to make us aware of what's happening within our borders and beyond, and then build those coalitions that sometimes move the needle just a bit, but it's enough to start to start a movement, or at least to start improving the system.
Well, thank you for that background. That'll be informative for all our listeners, I'm sure. Rob, do you have a final question?
Well, Anne-Raphaëlle, I guess it's unfortunate you can't make our London summit that's coming up.
Sorry.
But it sounds like you will be reaching out, if you haven't already, to foreign investors. We'd love to have you next year for the 4th annual, if you're able to make it then.
Yes.
Yeah, I will put it in my calendar for sure. I'll tell you, I hadn't heard about that forum. So I at first, when Lynn forwarded it to me, I thought it was London, Ontario, just to tell you.
Probably as expensive to get to London, Ontario as it is to London, England from Nunavut.
Yes, but no, next year, so 2027, I will be there, if you have me.
Excellent.
Of course,
absolutely.
We'll have further progress on the project.
Yes.
As well. Just before we wrap up, is there something that we didn't touch on that you would like to highlight?
No, I think that was excellent. I mean, as you can tell, I love talking about the Arctic and love talking about the project. And I'm grateful always for the opportunity to shine the light on the work that we do. So just want to say thank you.
Okay, well, it certainly has been fascinating. Thank you very much for your time today. It's been great, very intensive and very informative.
Awesome.
And it's one of the huge economic opportunities in front of those looking at investing in Canada. So thank you very much.
Yes. Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time and for the opportunity.
Okay. We'll just
Thanks,
count down.
Anne-Raphaëlle.
Thank you to Anne-Raphaëlle Audouin for sharing her insights with us. And thank you for viewing and listening. Mark your calendars for the upcoming 2026 summit taking place on the 8th of April. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.